this is a pivot point. Whatever the lesson of this conflict in Ukraine is, will really drive what the next 10 and 20 years of geopolitics looks like.
G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas, and it's the biggest doozy of a dangerous idea of all when it comes to world peace. It's the reason why the Ukraine war ever mattered in the first place. The dangerous idea is this, that prior to the Second World War, certainly prior to the First World War, the majority of humans, in the majority of places at the majority of times, lived under regimes that were constantly under threat of attack from their neighbours. And we invested vastly too much in both human capital and in money and treasure and blood in avoiding being invaded or trying to invade other people. And World War II changed all that, and we managed to erect the imperfect artifices of the United Nations and NATO and other international norms, all underpinned by an American security guarantee that ensured that countries would not just randomly send tanks over the borders of smaller neighbours and try to take their land. Russia's invasion of Ukraine changed that, and we now stand at a precipice, which is sort of no less pressing than it ever was, at which it seems entirely possible that the President of the United States and the leader of Russia will come to some kind of an arrangement to effectively allow Russia to win this war. It's worth reminding ourselves what the stakes are, taking a snapshot of where the conflict currently stands, what the upsides, downsides, perils, opportunities are of the current situation in Ukraine, what Donald Trump is trying to do, what Vladimir Putin is trying to do, and whether or not the interests of the people who actually live in Central and Eastern Europe should matter to us at all. Thus, we invite back on the show the one and only Misha Zelinsky. Misha was the Australian Financial Review's correspondent, war correspondent in Ukraine from 2022 to 2023. This is his second appearance on the show. We had him on in 2022 to give us a snapshot at a very different time during that conflict. He's a Fulbright Scholar and a national security expert. He tried to run for federal parliament in Australia at the last election, but that attempt was derailed. I would be very surprised if he doesn't try it again at some point in his future. He has his own podcast called Diplomates, not diplomats, but Mates, as in g'day mate, and he has the great honour of being personally sanctioned by the Vladimir Putin regime. We talk about Ukraine, but also its implications for global security, Taiwan, China, and all the rest of it. Misha's book is entitled The Sun Will Rise. It's a novel based on his time in Ukraine. I hope you enjoy as much as I did, the one and only Misha Zelinsky. What have you been making of the events of the, I guess, foreign policy from the Trump administration since... Can you believe it's only...
What is it, 63 days or something? It feels like 63 years. It's genuinely... Like, before the Trump presidency, my friends in the sort of foreign policy, geopolitical space, national security space, I always say to them, does it feel like the world's going faster? And it really, sped up with the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, but it has gone into like, I don't know, from hyperdrive to ultra hyperdrive.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It's impossible to keep up almost, which is in some ways a strategy from the Trump team and the Trump White House. But from a geopolitical point of view, it's a cliche now. It's the Lenin thing of, sometimes, nothing happens in decades, but weeks happen in decades, or decades happens in weeks. And where it feels a little bit like that kind of real pivotal moment in history.
How are you personally sorting through what's worth paying attention to and what's not?
We've got to look at what the big things are. There are a few very big things happening. There's a lot of things happening in the United States, domestic politics, which have profound implications for geopolitics everywhere. Like Australia, we're very staked in what happens in the United States. We're waiting to get nuclear submarines in 7 years. Clearly.
You should hear the conversation that I just had with the former Premier of New South Wales and former Foreign Minister of Australia, Bob Carr.
I know the bullet points. He's
like, it's never going to happen. They're never going to give us the nuclear subs. And I was like, let's just suppose they will. He was like, they won't. I was like, let's suppose they will. He was like, yeah, but they're not going to. I was like,
wow.
Thought experiment, Bob. Thought experiment.
Look, Bob's very stridently opposed, but nevertheless, look, it's important that what happens in the United States implicates policy in Australia. And so we need to watch what's happening there. But geopolitically, there are kind of three big theaters around the world that matter. The Middle East, whether or not there's going to be an enduring peace there, that continues to sort of simmer away and flare up.
Shouldn't be too hard, right?
No.
Israel-Palestine?
Easy one to fix.
Yep.
Knock that over on that too. But so that's obviously devilishly complex. You've got China's ambitions in East Asia. No hot war there, but a lot of activity, a lot of grey zone interference. It's the reason why we want nuclear submarines. China, very active, pushing into the territory of its neighbouring nations. War exercises off the coast of Australia only a couple of weeks ago, which terrifying and, to my mind, really showcase the need for things like nuclear submarines and Virginia-class submarines.
Just pause on that for a second.
Yep.
So the anti-nuclear submarine US alliance faction would say that's precisely why we don't need to hitch our wagon to some vast geostrategic global US-led nuclear submarine, like complicated malarkey, and why we need to focus, why we should instead be investing those massive resources in a really good, solid, local, conventional submarine fleet to be patrolling our waters and making sure that China doesn't shit on us in our...
Yeah, that's an attractive argument, right? And we should have indigenous capability in our military hardware and kit and ability to self-produce it.
Is the use of the word indigenous there politically incorrect? Are you going to get cancelled by the wokesters using it? Because I don't think First Nations people had any submarines, nuclear or otherwise.
Well, I mean, I'll leave others to make that their mind up.
While you flail, I'm going to enjoy a delicious hot beverage. I've got a coffee right here.
But to talk about in a nuclear submarine capacity, it's the world's best nuclear submarines. When you look at what's available in the market, Australia is a huge landmass surrounded by water. So we need asymmetric capability. We need the ability to defend our perimeter and also to have asymmetric capability where our adversaries don't know where we are. And so a nuclear submarine, unlike a diesel submarine, can stay underwater in perpetuity, essentially until you run out of supplies, right? Or the crew needs to be switched out, can stay under months at a time. There is nothing close to approaching the capability of what the Virginia class can do. It's the best in the market. And we are one of the unique beneficiaries. Like no other nation in the world, apart from the United Kingdom in 1958, has been shared the jewels in the crown of US, critical military capabilities and nuclear submarines.
It's only useful if you actually want your submarines to be up in the Taiwan Straits. It's not useful for securing the homeland.
No, that's not.
And secondly, it comes with massive liabilities, like it puts a huge target on our back and means that if
China
China
got a target on our back.
Well, not so much that China has to nuke us if they're in a war with
Pine Gap,
the United States.
Pine Gap is a critical capability for the United States. At the end of the day,
that's a security and intelligence base in the Australian outback.
Things get boiled right down to is the United States going to go to war with China rather than what are China's ambitions around the world? And so for Australia, we need friends and we need capability. The United States, the Trump administration notwithstanding, is a critical friend of Australia. And we need the capability to defend ourselves as well. And so we've always worked together with friends, whether it's the British Empire back in the day or whether it's the United States, whether it's European or right-thinking democratic nations like Indonesia, like Japan, like India. You look at the Quad. People talk about AUKUS. That's Australia, England, and the United States. But the Quad is a critical partnership.
The Quad is Japan and India and the United States and Australia.
Now, what do they have in common?
Talk fest.
What do they have in common is that they're all democracies and they're all worried about the rise of the Chinese Communist Party. And so the capability that we have and the friends that we have are critical in defending Australia. And I think I boil it down to this. Massive landmass, relatively small country, surrounded by water. We want the very, very best undersea capability, and there is nothing approaching a Virginia-class submarine in terms of capability.
Even if it drags us into a war that we would otherwise have the luxury of choosing whether to be involved in?
Well, that's a sort of a leap where I don't necessarily support the underlying thesis. There's no obligation for us to go to war with the United States. The United States goes to war. It's making its own decision. But also, let's step back from that.
Well, but the obligation is not that we would have to declare war. It's that war would have to be declared upon us because we would be functionally a part of the United States. Militarily would be part of the United States. A world where,
I assume you're talking about a world where China is at war with the United States.
Yeah, that's right.
That is going to be a profoundly massive conflict that would have far broader implications than what Australia decides to do in those
circumstances. Right, but having a submarine base nuked would make it additionally bad.
If you have a situation where nuclear warfare is at play, we haven't seen nuclear war ever in play, thankfully, since the nukes were created in the 1940s. If you talk about Australia being nuked, I mean, the profoundly wild scenarios are at play there where I would imagine we would want to go to war anyway. But I think the idea that Australia would be nuked because the United States and China are at war is just like a kind of a leap by 3- and 4-fold that I think is not
well. Isn't strategizing 3- and 4-fold out precisely the point of defense strategy?
To bring it to a real live example.
I mean, if you're allergic to that idea, then you can just say massive conventional aerial bombardment.
But the United States
of US military assets that we would not otherwise be in possession.
Well, let's take an example that's live. Ukraine's being supported by the United States in its war against Russia, resisting Russia's invasion. Russia has not nuked Ukraine, nor has it nuked the United States, despite the capacity to do so. So I just think that it's a furphy. I don't think we should be thinking about whether or not there's risks of us being, attacked by nuclear weapons or conventional weapons when we're thinking about how to arm ourselves.
Why wouldn't you think about whether or not we're going to get attacked by nuclear or conventional weapons when you're thinking about our defense strategy?
What I'm most worried,
the whole point of
but what I'm most worried about is the ability to resist conventional subsea or on surface naval exercises off our coast, and the ability to resist that is heightened with the superior technology that
you're most worried about resisting exercises.
Well, what does an exercise lead to, right? Why is China showing that it can perform these things off our coast? Because it wants to intimidate us, and the way to stop being intimidated by a larger opponent is have asymmetric capability. If we have asymmetric capability undersea, it'll make China think twice.
But what do you mean by asymmetric in that case?
Having superior tech. China
we're
does
not
not have.
We're not going to be. It's not going to be. We're not going to be asymmetric with China.
Well,
we're never going to have a better military than China.
Well, the Virginia class is way better than anything the Chinese can produce.
Yeah, and we'll have what, 3 of them?
Well, 3 to 5, maybe more. As we
how quickly will their naval capabilities outstrip ours?
Well, the thing about it's not about just simple numeric numbers. It's about how good your quality of your tech is, right? And what I'm saying is, yes, China's producing a lot of military equipment at the moment, but it's not as good as what you see currently, at least in the Western hemisphere.
You don't think that being so closely interwoven into the US military machine makes the homeland of Australia more of a target were we to come to blows with China?
Look, I mean,
or do you think that is true, but it's nonetheless worth?
What I'd say is we're already deeply woven into the United States, military hardware. Those are decisions that we've made as a country for like 40 years. I think at the end of the day, you've got to choose who your friends are in the world, and the United States, for all its faults, is still a good friend to Australia.
What if your friends don't care about who their friends are?
Well, that's a whole other question. And I mean, there is a profound change underway now in US geostrategic posture, and it's a worry, right? I genuinely do worry about that. And I think everyone's right to worry about it. Now, whether or not this becomes a permanent fixture or if it's a temporary problem, we don't know, right? But look, the Trump administration has upending, years or decades of thought in this space. But I don't think that changes the questions around what kit you want. You still want the best kit. And the best kit on the shelf right now is a Virginia-class nuclear submarine.
I sidetracked you a little bit from articulating the three things. So you said the Middle East in terms of geostrategic considerations.
Domestic policy in the United States.
There's the United States. What was number 3?
Oh, so domestic policy in the United States.
Yeah. The Middle East.
Middle East.
Yes.
What China's ambitions are, which I think we've sort of ventilated at length. And then, of course, obviously the hot war in Ukraine. So you got like a regional war in Middle East. You've got a Cold War, if you want to phrase it in those terms, but grey zone, foreign interference type conflict and assertiveness going on in East Asia, in our neck of the woods, and into the South Pacific. And then you've got a hot war, a land war in Europe of mass attempted conquering, which we haven't really seen since World War II.
And how's it going?
Brutally and awfully. It's a peculiar war, Josh, in that I describe it as both ultra high tech and ultra low tech. So high tech, the types of weapons you've never seen before, the use of drones is actually changed warfare extraordinarily. Drones in the air is like hundreds of thousands in the theater at any one time, hundreds of thousands in the air at any one time. So war has changed profoundly in that sense, and the ability now to use very cheap drones to attack very expensive kit, like essentially blow up a tank with a very cheap drone, is changing the way tactically war is fought. But then at the same time, you still need men with guns to take terrain, and the war on the front line is brutal and almost World War I style trench warfare of a meat grinder. And particularly when you look at the tactics that the Russians are using, where they are just throwing walls, that they call walls of meat, but walls of men running into gunfire and artillery fire. The casualty rate is massive.
Who are they using at the moment? Because even a year ago, they were already having to pull people out of prisons and across Russia and send them out. I mean, no one wanted to go to the front line.
It's a combination of conscription. So the Russians have conscription, and a combination of recruitment out of places like the prison system, et cetera, and saying you can get out early and we'll pay a lot of money. Also paying a lot for people to go. And like any war, it's the poor people as well in regional areas. And the Russian, Putin's base is in Petersburg and Moscow. The Russian middle class, not many of them are fighting, though increasingly they're going to have to, some of them. But you see a lot of the poorer, outer, regional, rural areas, and also the ethnic minorities that are doing the fighting as well. So it is brutal stuff and awful stuff.
Who are the ethnic minorities?
So you see the Stan parts of the world. So Dagestan and other, essentially, I mean, Russia is still relatively racist kind of country where they try to run a monocultural Russo culture where Russian's preeminent, but there are a lot of ethnic minorities, Muslim minorities and others that they draw
from the Central Asian parts of it. Yeah, right. You say that they're going to have to start drawing on more people, but maybe they won't if the great President Trump and President Putin can come to an agreement.
Well, that's a great if, isn't it? I think what Trump's realizing is he said he could solve the war in one day. I think, what did we say, we're 60 odd days in, so we still haven't got a resolution. So 60 days minimum over his own deadline. I think, he came away from a 2-hour conversation with Putin rather. They had a 2-hour conversation where Trump came away with a ceasefire that was only for aerial bombardment, which was immediately broken, and agreement to play an ice hockey match between Australia, the United States and Russia. So not much of an agreement. They just had a meeting overnight where, again, not much was agreed. They've come away saying, they're going to have an increased ceasefire on the oceans. There's an informal one in place anywhere where effectively the Russians and the Ukrainians are not attacking each other's merchant sea capacity. And also the Russians got smashed up so massively by the Ukrainian military that they kind of have pulled back. They had their flagship sunk, which has not happened since the Falklands War, by the Ukrainians who have no navy. So the Russians...
This was ages ago, right?
Yeah. It was
a couple of years ago.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And so the Black Sea ceasefire is already kind of informally in place, if not formally. The Russians are already kind of breaking many of the terms of the ceasefire. So what Trump's working out is he may want peace. And look, we all want peace, right? But peace at any price would be a bad peace. And the price for peace that Putin has said from the outset is he wants Ukraine's sovereignty. He wants to own Ukraine. Now, leaving aside how you might feel about the Ukrainians, have got strong views about whether or not they want to be owned by the Russians. They've made it very clear, and they're paying with their own blood for their freedom. And so whether or not they're going to get to a peace, it really depends on what Trump is prepared to trade away. And there's all manner of moving parts here. You saw the meeting with Zelensky in the White House, which was awful and very shocking, I think, for many people around the world to see, the United States, the leader of the free world for many, many decades since World War II, berating a fellow Democratic leader, telling him to be more grateful, and J.D. Vancing to him as well. And it was just awful to see. But then the Ukrainians pivoted from that very quickly. They're smart and dexterous in their foreign policy, managed to get to a situation where the Russians now are kind of seen to be the side that aren't coming to the party in the deal. But any terms of the deal, I'd always be skeptical of, because the Russians, one thing Vladimir Putin always does is breaks his word. He's done that for 20 years. The lesson of deals with Putin is he never honors them. For 20 years, anytime he's done something bad and said that'll be the last time I do it, and we believe him, he does something worse. So bad behavior unpunished becomes worse behavior, right? And so his ability to continually fool us, like it's fool me once, shame on me, fool me 100 times. Like, I don't know there's no pun for that, but he's done that consistently. Sorry to cut across you, but you go, look at his history. 2008, he invades Georgia. The world sort of does nothing. 2014, he invades Ukraine for the first time, annexes Crimea, starts a war in Donbass. 2016, he medals in the US election, he medals in Brexit. He starts a war in Ukraine of conquest in 2022. Effectively, there's been sanctions, but not much, right? The penalties have not been high. And if in the end, Putin's on the verge of a strategic defeat here, if we give him a strategic victory, the lesson for him will be what? Yeah, you start a problem, you make the problem big enough, in the end, the West capitulates because they get bored or there's other priorities, and that's a lesson to him and others.
Why do you say he's on the verge of a strategic defeat?
Well, he's already had one. Look, his economy is a mess, right? So if you look at where Putin started in 2022 and to where he is now, he's literally blown up his biggest market for his biggest export. So Ukrainian territories where they used to sell Russian gas into Europe. Now that market is gone. Their other biggest market is oil. That's been completely handicapped in terms of how they can make money. Now, they're still selling oil, but the Indians and the Chinese are extorting them at very cheap prices and making hay out of it, essentially. And so his economy is ruined. Their interest rates are at 21%, inflation at 9%. So, they got, I think it depends on how you calculate it, but hundreds of billions of US dollars frozen overseas in their own wealth and assets. So that's the kind of economic consequences of it. In terms of the military consequences, he's had his army humiliated. This is meant to have been at least the second most powerful military in the world. They've had perhaps nearly 1 million casualties of injuries and deaths. Now, even if it's 500,000, it depends, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million, right? Huge numbers of people that have died. Now, Russia's a big country, 140 million people, but no country can lose 500,000 to 1 million young people. He's had 1 million flee as well from the conscription we talked about earlier. So that's a kind of military humiliation. Half the tanks he had before he started blown up. So they have just been completely shown to be a paper tiger when it comes to military. Their prestige around the world is destroyed. They've essentially not got many friends left. So, and what's he managed to gain in the process? Some incremental gains of Ukrainian territory. It seems like a very high price to pay for all that, very little gain. And
right,
so
but all of those strategic defeats were banked within the first 6 months of the war, basically. I mean, in terms of
the economic and military pain is ongoing.
Yes,
when
it continues, but it was clear pretty quickly that the world sort of got our shit together on sanctions, and so that was going to be tricky. I guess when you say he's on the verge of strategic defeat, that sounds more optimistic than the way most people would
it comes
frame
down to us, right? If it's a contest between Russia and Ukraine, over time, Russia wins that contest just because of sheer weight of force of men, material, a larger economy. Over time, they can grind them down if they're prepared to pay a high price, which the Russians are showing that they are. Now, they're paying, I would argue, an unsustainable price, but over time, if Ukraine's left to its own devices, logic would tell you that if Russia is prepared to keep paying the price that it is, it will make Ukraine suffer and take more and more of its territory. But wars are fought on industrial bases. And so if it's Russia versus Ukraine, then, well, the outcome is probably more leaning towards a Russian victory. But if it's Russia versus everybody else, then it's a whole different ballgame. And that's where it's been up until recently, where suddenly we've decided we don't want to send weapons to Ukraine. And I would argue that the ability to not only defeat Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, but to teach a lesson to any other dictator that we can't have wars of conquest in the 21st century. That's a lesson that we can teach Putin permanently and every other wannabe dictator that wants to go and start a war of this nature. Now, the Ukrainians are prepared to do the fighting. They're prepared to do the dying, and they're showing that every day with their bravery. All they're asking for is weapons. Now, that's the deal of the century. If you compare to what we had to do in World War II, World War I, and other major conflicts around the world, all we got to do is send our stuff. So the way I see it, and we sort of talked about the stakes, this is a pivot point. Whatever the lesson of this conflict in Ukraine is, will really drive what the next 10 and 20 years of geopolitics looks like. If the lesson is you shouldn't invade your neighbors, democracies can resist dictatorships, and big countries can't crush small countries because they don't like them, that'd be good. But if the lesson is you can do that, Australia's a country of 26 million people. We cannot survive in a world where big countries destroy little countries, where might is right. That's a dangerous world for Australia. So if you never want to see war, we talked before about conflict in our region, whether or not we get dragged into a conflict with the United States and China or a major world conflict. If you never want to see a conflict like that, if you never want to see tanks having to be deployed in Australia or in our region, then send those tanks to Ukraine. That is the single best way to make sure that we never have conflict anywhere else around the world. And I believe that passionately. So it's not about charity. Sending stuff to Ukraine, whether you're Australia or another nation around the world. It's also not some sort of like bleeding heart or sort of forward-leaning foreign policy where we've got to promote democracy around the world. It's saying this is a national security objective of Australia that big countries cannot destroy small ones.
It feels a little bit like we're talking in 2023 in the sense that let's suppose that Donald Trump hadn't won the election. Yeah. Let's suppose that the US administration was full rah-rah-rah on Ukraine.
Right.
What would we be doing right now that would lead to a decisive military defeat for Russia since, as you mentioned before, it seems like it's a World War I style stalemate and a war of attrition? Like, in what universe is Ukraine retaking the east of Ukraine?
Well, weapons is the first step, right? We've never, ever given Ukraine the weapons they need to win. We've given Ukraine enough weapons not to lose. That's kind of been the unfortunate truth of what we've done. And everything we've given, the weird thing about military aid is you say, we're not going to give you these things, and then in the end you give them, but you give them too late for them to be comprehensively decisive on the battlefield. You remember, you go right back, can't give Ukraine tanks, gave them tanks. Can't give them HIMARS, we gave them HIMARS. Can't give you long-range missiles, gave them. You can't shoot these into Russian targets, and they've done all these things, right? But when the time to do them, where it may have been most decisive, we haven't done it. Like, you think about the fact that Putin survived a near coup because of the pressure he was under. Like, all those things I talked about, the pressure on Russian society is high. You talk about cost of living, you got inflation running double digits for that long. You've got unemployment, not unemployment, but high levels of casualties in your community. Like, that pressure and the cut off from the world. In the end, something popped, and Prigozhin, staged kind of a half coup, and there are no half coups. Yeah, you got to go the whole way.
And then he strangely had some aviation difficulties.
Well, indeed, right? And that we can talk about what that means for the Putin regime, but ultimately,
couldn't you make the argument that a flailing autocrat who's been backed into a corner is a risky, entity to provoke, and so that's why you're cautious about what you give Ukraine? You don't want to come out of the gate giving Ukraine the capacity to strike well into Russia and then escalate it into, at the time, Putin was saying this will be World War III, nukes
but he hasn't
on the table.
Done it, has he?
Well, he didn't, but hindsight's 2020.
My analysis of Putin, when he talks about nuclear weapons, the war is going very badly for him. You actually look at whenever he starts saying, well, just never forget Russia's got nuclear weapons, it's generally when things aren't going particularly well.
That doesn't mean that it's not a risk.
No, look, I mean, you should, when anyone says nuclear warfare, you should pay attention. But you think about it, though, it's a bad choice and a worse choice. The bad choice is continuing to take him on and not buckle to him. The worst choice is, what lesson are you teaching Putin if he says nuclear weapons and we go, shit, like we capitulate and we back off, right? He knows then he's got us cowed in a way, right? So you need to take him seriously, but not be completely terrified of what he might do. And look, there's big consequences to that. And privately, I think it's been communicated that what the consequences would be. And also, I think what's interesting about the nuclear stuff is, even when you talk about tactical nuclear weapons, which people talk about tactical nuclear weapons, what are they? Just small nukes that can potentially use on the battlefield, but no one's ever obviously used them. When he was talking about nukes quite a bit, the Chinese had a back channel where they said, look, mate, just cool it on that. And there's been less talk of that from Putin, because obviously China's right on the border of the Russians and not interested in nuclear warfare on their doorstep.
When you say that behind the scenes, it's probably been made clear to him what the consequences would be of crossing that Rubicon. I do remember hearing some rumors about what the Biden administration might have been talking about, but do you have any suspicions about? So there was a moment where, I think in 2023, where it seemed that the conversation about his potential use of tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield was that was talked at a peak.
Yeah.
And Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, I think, right at the time, went to Moscow, had a meeting with Putin or his foreign minister, and then all of a sudden that went away. And I heard some people saying, like, it's interesting. It's fascinating to sort of think about what the sticks are in the carrot and stick metaphor, that the United States basically said, listen, if this happens, then instantaneously this happens, and this happens. So quit it. Do you know what this
I mean, there's all manner of different things they could do, and there were some theories that essentially the Americans would immediately sink Russia's entire Black Sea fleet, that they could deploy their own, literally deploy US military into Ukraine, that they could strike Russia. Like, there's a lot of things that the Americans are not doing that they could do to Putin and his armies right now that they're not. Like, what's extraordinary is the Ukrainians have been holding off Russia with really kind of the stuff in the warehouse, right? Like, the Americans have been kind of, what do we got here? Yeah, you can have some of this stuff. And they've been using that to hold the Russians off. The American military might has not nearly been brought to bear on Putin. So, like, there's a lot of scary things they could do. And I'm sure that was communicated. And so in terms of the use of battlefield nuclear weapons, the other reason why I think Putin didn't do them, other than the fact that there would have been consequences for him, and not just consequences from the United States, but I think anyone that's been tacitly supporting him, whether it's the Indians continuing to buy things or the Chinese, giving black market support of, equipment and other material, that would have been it. It's completely unsustainable to continue to support them in any fashion. So Russia would have been utterly isolated at that point as well. But the thing about the use of tactical nuclear weapons is they wouldn't have been decisive. The Ukrainians have got a modern military approach. They don't, funnily enough, the Russians still do it to a large extent, where they will pull their they'll pull their soldiers and tanks all together in one area. The Ukrainians are spread out. So where are you launching them and how and why? So it's attractive as an idea, but all you really do is create a lot of damage in an area, environmentally, but you wouldn't create a battlefield advantage.
Right.
So Putin doesn't get a battlefield decisive victory by using them. Suddenly he's got complete isolation from his allies. Or he's got
friends. No one to sell anything to.
Correct. And no way God knows what the Americans might do, right? Yeah. So you kind of look at that and go, why would I do it? Where it remains useful is still as I might use them, right? And so for the reasons I talked about with you earlier, it's often scarier to say you might do something to actually go through and do it. Because once you've done it, then you go, well, it's happened now. I can price it in. Whereas that fear of unknown still does, it has and continues to create a degree of hesitation in policymakers' minds for the reasons you've said. I think fundamentally you have to grit your teeth and ignore it. You can't completely discount it, but you got to also remember Putin's, whilst he's a megalomaniac dictator, he still fundamentally is a cunning rat who wants to survive, and that would be kind of essentially a fatal move for him.
So I just want to clarify what best case and worst case scenarios are from where we stand now. Right?
We'll go in there and then we kind of dig.
So let's take it as a given that that what should have happened when he first invaded Ukraine is that we should have thrown more unrestricted long-range weapons at Ukraine and said, go for it.
Yep.
Go for it, kiddos. And hopefully that we wouldn't have ended up in the situation that we're in, where there's effectively a stalemate border in the east of the country. Now that we have that, do you still see a universe in which Ukraine becomes whole again and retakes Crimea or something?
It would be hard.
What's good case scenario?
So there's kind of what could happen, which, as I said, you could give them the weapons to get the job done, and they grind out a tough come from behind victory, right? Now, does that seem likely? No, it doesn't seem likely. It can't happen without United States support, right? And that does not appear to be on offer from the Trump administration. So then what becomes probable? Well, what in an ideal world you'd still want to do is give Ukraine, the advantage on the battlefield that that Putin feels as though he's got to make a deal because he's starting to lose, right? At the moment, I think Putin thinks, well, it's kind of all going my way. That's why he's being recalcitrant on any sort of 30-day ceasefire. He's like, well, why would I do it? I'm kind of grinding forward here. You guys look like you're about to capitulate anyway. Stuff it, right? But a world where Ukraine looks like it's starting to make gains, I think makes their position stronger. But fundamentally, the real big decision here is what is the price of peace. So if Putin's able to extract out of the United States, Europeans and others that Ukraine's on its own, then I think if you're a betting man, Putin's going to retool and come back for the rest. If they're on their own, and they've got no security guarantees, then eventually it's going to, I think, end very, very badly for the world and for Ukrainians. And so is it going to be possible to expel Russian troops from all of the landmass they currently occupy? Extremely hard. So therefore, what's the price of peace need to be? It needs to be that Ukraine is safe and secure and sovereign in its own borders, that it has security guarantees that are bankable. And you've got to remember Ukraine's memory of security guarantees, and this is a history lesson, but the 1994 Budapest Agreement, they had the largest arsenal of nuclear weapons outside outside of Russia and the US.
And
gave them up.
To remind people, that's because they were part of the Soviet Union. And so the Soviet Union at the time...
And they were storing them in Ukraine.
Well, I mean, it's an obviously good spot to have them because it's close to Europe.
Right.
So if you're an aggressor on Europe, you want to put them somewhere in the Soviet Union.
So they give them up.
Then the Soviet Union falls apart.
Right.
Ukraine becomes an independent country.
Correct.
And it's sitting on all these nukes.
Correct.
And the new Russia and the United States and everyone else goes, yeah, we don't want you having all these nukes. But don't worry, give us your nukes.
Right.
We'll guarantee that you're safe.
Perfectly put.
Fast forward a few decades, Russia invades.
Not so guaranteed.
Yeah, no, not going to happen.
Didn't happen. 2014 was when it was first tested and shown to be, complete bullshit. Right?
Yeah, right.
It didn't get, defended. And so you can understand they got some hesitation around, promises on paper.
So what does a promise on paper look like this
Well,
time
I think
around?
it looks like what the Europeans are talking about. Keir Starmer's talking about this. Emmanuel Macron's talking about this. Even Anthony Albanese's talking about what you got to have some level of allied or European or democratic soldiers on the ground maintaining a peace in Ukraine that keeps Ukraine safe, and that Russia then knows if we come back, we're not just taking on the Ukrainians, we're taking on everybody. And that's the only way to actually guarantee it. Now, short of NATO, NATO would be ideal. That, again, seems unlikely because the United States, essentially the way NATO works is, US being the big dog in the NATO arrangement, but everyone's got veto powers on new membership. And so that seems unlikely that would give them the guarantees they need. Article 5, mutual defense would give them that guarantee.
But is there not a conceivable arrangement where Ukraine does not join NATO, but NATO functions as the body that enforces the peace?
Whether it's NATO, the United States at this point under Trump are saying they're not going to provide any security guarantees. So what the Europeans are trying to do is to say, okay, we'll do the heavy lifting. Now, Trump's whole thing is the Europeans are bludgeoning on security basis. Now, that's kind of true over a long period of time with NATO spending. It's not true with the Ukraine conflict. They've been supporting Ukraine more than the United States have, and rightly so. It's on their doorstep, right? But nevertheless,
it's about half-half, isn't it? Yeah.
And so what the Europeans are saying, we'll go in, we'll be the cops on the ground, but we do need the United States to be a backstop if shit hits the fan and Russia comes back again.
Yeah.
And so I think some sort of peace that's secure and guaranteed where, okay, they're not in NATO, but they've got a NATO-esque type backing, and then they're in the European Union. At that point, what do the Ukrainians want out of this? They want to get away from Russia. They want to be European, and they want to be democratic, and they want to be free and liberal and get to enjoy the world that we have so grateful to have here in Australia. That type of life is what they aspire to. That would be a good peace, I think. I still think...
I mean, isn't it a massive economic hit? Isn't the eastern part of the country the breadbasket of Ukraine?
Yeah, it's interesting.
To hear the rest of this conversation, go to uncomfortableconversations.substack.com/listen, and you will get your own personal premium podcast feed with at least 3 extra episodes of the podcast every month and heaps of extra stuff, including the remainder right now of the fabulous conversation you've just been hearing. If it was worth listening to this much of, don't rob yourself of the rest. Pull out your phone right now and search for Uncomfortable Conversations on Substack.